Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Shuo, and I'm the director of the China Climate Hub at the Asia Society Policy Institute. I'll be moderating today's conversation titled China's Climate Path Forward Amid Trade Tensions and Global Expectations. 2025 is shaping up as a pivotal year for China's climate trajectory. Even as trade frictions and geopolitical tensions present serious headwinds, China's domestic green transition is gaining momentum. The country has emerged as a clean tech superpower, leading the world in the production and deployment of key low-carbon technologies. Yet, the domestic climate politics is still very complex. Powerful interest groups in the coal and heavy industries continue to resist stronger environmental and climate ambition. How will Beijing navigate these competing interests? What role will climate play in China's evolving relationships with other major powers? And what can the world expect from China in its upcoming climate commitments under the Paris Agreement? To help us unpack all these critical questions, we're joined today by Kate Logan, my colleague, Director of the China Climate Hub and Climate Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Anders Hove, Senior Research Fellow at Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, OIES. And Lauri Myllyvirta, a non-resident Senior Fellow at ASPE, and at the same time also the co-founder of the Center for Research and Energy and Clean Air. Lauri, let's dive in with you. Can you just walk us through some of the latest emissions trends that we are seeing in China? In particular, the long-standing question of whether and when China's emissions will peak.
Thank you, Lisha. So what happened over the past few years is a massive unprecedented acceleration in China's deployment of clean energy, particularly solar, but also wind and more recently nuclear. However, the other thing that happened was that during and after zero COVID, energy demand and electricity demand started to grow at abnormally rapid rates. And until early 2024, the abnormally rapid growth in energy demand was overpowering even these record clean energy increases. After that, there's been a crossover. So since the first quarter of 2024, China's overall CO2 emissions and power sector emissions have been coming down. The other major driver of China's emissions besides the power sector, construction, has already been coming down since 2021, when the measures to rein in financial leverage and risk in the real estate sector started to bite. So those two major largest sectors have started to come down. In transportation and in other industrial sectors, besides steel and cement, electrification is biting into emissions. So those are the three major forces pushing towards emissions peaking. The economic structure is also starting to normalize after the distortion introduced by zero COVID. So that's the bull story from the climate perspective. The risks to that downward trend in emissions continuing. There are also a few. So the obvious one is the coal to chemicals industry. That's where coal consumption is still growing. It's a major geopolitical and energy security bet for China's leadership. However, what they really want is to have the capacity in place. So it's not a given that that coal consumption in the sector will continue to grow. The other major question is, now that coal consumption and demand for coal-fired power generation are starting to come down, what will the coal industry and the thermal power industry do about that? So there could be pushback, there could be efforts to slow down, or there most certainly will be efforts to slow down the clean energy deployment, and so on. So in all of that, it's really important what kind of targets are set in the next 5-year plan, in the upcoming Paris commitment that China's due to make. And there are a couple of roadblocks that still need to be cleared. So in order to maintain the current rate of clean energy growth and additions, there needs to be more progress on reforming the power system. And then in the steel industry, very specifically, there roadblocks to shifting from coal-based steel making to using more electric arc steel making need to be overcome.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lauri. Kate, let's go to you. The Chinese government has already announced that they will announce their nationally determined contribution. This is the international climate commitment that they will make under the Paris Agreement. So they will announce their NDC before COP30 later this year. What's your expectation on China's NDC? And can you also help our audience unpack the complex set of domestic international considerations that Chinese government need to make in their NDC decision making?
Sure. So just as a little bit of background for our listeners, the Paris Agreement, which is the world's core multilateral agreement on climate, basically asks countries to update their NDCs, which stands for Nationally Determined Contribution, which are their core climate targets, every 5 years. So that agreement was adopted in 2015. Countries were expected to upgrade their targets first in 2020, and now it's 2025. And this is a really significant moment for China, the world's largest emitter, because these new targets are expected to cover emissions out to the year 2035. And in China's case, as Lauri alluded, this means that this is the first time China's target will actually indicate what it plans to do after its emissions peak, which it's promised to do before 2030. So there's a huge difference between China basically reaching peak emissions but having its emissions plateau for a few years and then decline, versus its emissions declining based on a straight line scenario, say to 2035 and beyond to its net zero target in 2060. And in addition to that, we've seen some signals already from the China side. Most notably in late April, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, together with President Lula of Brazil, convened a meeting on climate, which Xi Jinping attended along with about 20 other countries, and said himself for the first time, reiterated what China had already indicated, which is that it will release its target, which will include all economic sectors and all greenhouse gases before COP30. So we have that word at the highest level, but I would say also we have more questions and answers at this point. So there's 3 key elements that I want to highlight for our audience to be watching for in the context of China's target. The first is, what is the headline figure? And in particular, does that align with the Paris Agreement's target for the world to maintain progress toward keeping temperature rise under 1.5 degrees? And the analysis essentially says for China to stay on track, especially toward its 2060 net zero target, this has to be around 30% or higher. That's a tall order for China, but basically how close can China actually get to that figure? And in particular, is there room built in for China to increase ambition? So does China put forward a figure that basically maybe includes a range or, something around best efforts to increase its ambition, after that first figure that it puts forward? And a second element of this that's important to watch for is, what is the base year? So does China sort of indicate very loosely that it will reduce its emissions from when they peak, but doesn't indicate when they might actually peak, in terms of the structure of the target? Or is it something where, there might be a symbolic year, such as 2025? So, say, for instance, if China is actually peaking emissions this year, as the data may be indicating, obviously it's too early to tell for sure, is that something that sort of indicates, ambition in line with what a reduction from the peak might actually be in practice? 2 other pieces. The second is, how does China include all of the greenhouse gases apart from carbon? So to date, its primary targets have been just for carbon dioxide emissions. There's been a big push in recent years for China to control methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas that is shorter lived than carbon, but much more, potent in the near term. So if China can reduce those emissions, and it has, as of a few years ago, a national methane action plan. This was a big diplomatic push from the U.S., but now that the U.S. is out of the picture, will China continue its leadership on some of their really important greenhouse gases that have much stronger impacts in the near term, for instance? And will those be included in the headline figure? Will it be covered, will it cover all greenhouse gases, or will they be additional targets included in different ways? So I think ideally we'd like to see all of those greenhouse gases included in the headline target. And then finally, will China include other targets for specific sectors? I'd say coal is certainly one area to watch. It would be tremendous if China made some sort of commitment around no new coal-fired power plants, going forward, but also build out for new renewable energy. Is that something that perhaps maybe the headline target is a bit weaker, but China commits to renewable energy build out in line with what that pathway that we want to see could be, or other targets for electric vehicles or the steel sector, for instance? So maybe I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks very much, Kate. I very much agree with you that this upcoming 2035 climate targets that will be announced by the Chinese government, I think presents an opportunity for the country to both embark on, strong and ambitious, long-term targets, but also to further ratchet up what the country will do in the very near term, including whether the country can peak its emissions well in advance of 2030. Anders, let's turn to you. One thing that we haven't mentioned in this conversation, of course, is the very rapid and impressive growth in China's clean tech sector, wind, solar, battery energy storage, and electric vehicles, and so on. And of course, the rapid growth of these sectors, as Lauri alluded to, has very much helped China to manage its growing emissions. My question to you, Anders, is do you expect this strong momentum in China's clean tech sector to continue in the next few years? And how do you react to the increasing domestic industrial problems that we're hearing from China, the overcapacity, the fierce competition, and perhaps some upcoming bankruptcies?
Yeah, I do expect this build out to continue. I'm most optimistic, in fact, about that aspect because the three new industries, the solar, EV, and battery industries, have been such a strong pillar of growth, as Lauri and his team have documented actually in several issues of their newsletter, how important those have been to GDP growth and indeed to industrial growth in other sectors in the economy, to the potential for new industrial strategies for the regions that are most invested in those sectors. I think it's hard to expect a dramatic climb down from the installation rates that have happened in the past few years, even though those installation rates were far in excess of any targets and far in excess of any market or industry expectations, especially those that were publicly announced. But I think it's been so surprising. And I would point especially to the electric vehicle space, actually, where the penetration rate of EVs or new energy vehicles, NEVs, was around 5-6% for several years running up until 2020 pandemic year. And then now it's, roughly 50% market penetration in new vehicle sales. But the targets have not been changed. So there have been a few modest new targets announced, but they were so unambitious that it was clear to the industry that they would be vastly exceeded. And officially, the target for this year is still that NEVs would only be 20% of the total market for new vehicles. And I think that is where I have a little bit of a disagreement with some things that Kate mentioned about the NDC, which is I personally would not expect any new ambitious quantitative targets, maybe one or two things that would go beyond present policy. But I think that even in the past NDCs and international commitments, including Sunnyland's declaration, there's a very strong tendency for Chinese policy, and this is similar to most other countries, by the way, to simply reiterate the most ambitious aspects of domestic policy, but not to go very far beyond. And indeed, in the 5-year plans, the targets for renewables, the targets for EVs, I already mentioned, have been somewhat lacking in ambition relative to what is actually going on already in the market. So then the real question goes back, I think, to what Lauri was alluding to earlier, which is the pushback that has, I think, already been seen in the last few years and then also in this year. And one of the things that I think we're tracking very closely, anybody who's looking at renewables, is document 136. This is a policy where all of a sudden it was announced kind of a few months ago that starting at the beginning of this month, renewables would have to trade in the market. The market that exists in most provinces is just a monthly and annual contract market, and that the kind of long-term contracts would no longer be available under fixed price rules for most people. And then the provinces would have to set a maximum and minimum threshold for prices in the market that would be earned by renewables. And then also the provinces would have to set the volume that would be available to earn this price range. And other than that, renewables would just be subject to the market and be potentially not paid. And that has led to a big hiccup in installations. There was a big rush at the end of the last month, and indeed, most provinces haven't even announced a plan, even though this is in theory already in place. And then, of course, most provinces don't have a spot power market. So the idea of kind of a contract for difference, that's hard to see. I think that the central government will try to make sure that policies do not get too far out of line that would cause an actual collapse in installations this year. And indeed, installations were so strong in the first 5 months of the year that it's not going to be a total collapse anyway. But I think that there are provinces, and I'd point to East Inner Mongolia, that said essentially no renewables will be available to earn this fixed, not fixed, but price range under this new 136 mechanism. I think as well in the electric vehicle space, there would be concern that there haven't been any new ambitious targets. There's no idea of phasing out fossil fuel vehicles anytime soon. I had been anticipating that would be a feel-good target to include in several of the planning documents that came out in the past few years, but it has not been included so far. And I guess what I've heard is that there's concern that doing anything that would raise ambition on the EV space would also be kind of a little bit hard for some of the state-owned companies to suffer. So I think that the build out of wind and solar will basically continue at pace, and I think that that's what we need. And we don't need a dramatic increase of ambition on either NEVs or wind and solar, but it's the pushback that I'm watching.
Thanks, Anders. Let me bring in a further wrinkle here, which is, of course, the global trade tensions, in particular, the U.S. China trade war. I should also note that trade war is quickly expanding into kind of a conflict between the two sides on export control. And just to stamp our conversation, we're recording this on June 10th. Anders, how do you see that U.S. China trade related tensions kind of affecting China's clean tech sector in the next few years?
Well, I'm going to take another page from Lauri and just say that the United States was a tiny market for most of these technologies for China, especially for the EV space, where already the Biden administration had announced essentially tariffs that amounted to totally blocking EVs. Of course, batteries are coming to the United States from China, and that has been an issue for the rollout in the United States. And then, of course, solar. The United States would clearly need solar from Europe, from China, in order to continue to expand the solar capacity. So the trade dispute does clearly affect the United States' ability to build out its clean energy capacity or its EV capacity. But as for its impact on China, I think that is more difficult to estimate, just because it's more difficult to see that would be a major impact on China just because of the relatively small size of the US market. Now, that said, it has led most Chinese companies to focus on other regions of the world, including Europe, including the UK, including Latin America, Africa, and everywhere else in the world. And I think that there is a very accurate perception on the part of Chinese companies, especially in that EV space, which is the most controversial from a trade tension point of view. There's an accurate perception that the leading economies, the advanced manufacturing economies, have kind of let go of that rest of the world market, assuming that it would always be there. And Chinese companies can see that their products are definitely more cost competitive, but now the EV infrastructure in other countries starting to build out as well. So many small can be equal to one large in the case of both clean energy, renewable energy, and then especially for electric vehicles.
Yeah, Laura, you have been kind of looking into trade data, right? In terms of China's export of clean tech products to the rest of the world. What are the major trends that you're seeing? Are there kind of hotspot countries that you're looking into?
I think the big picture is exactly what Anders described. So it's much more spread out than having one or two major countries. Chinese clean tech products are going essentially everywhere in the world. But in terms of regions, one trend that I've highlighted is the growing importance of global south, so developing and emerging economies. So if we take the four major clean tech, clean energy products, solar, wind, batteries, EVs, for all except batteries, the global south, broadly understood, has overtaken the old developed world as the key as the larger destination. It's easy to point to countries with very impressive growth in solar uptake, like Pakistan or South Africa, and several Middle Eastern economies, but it's still the broad-based nature of the boom. That's the most convincing part. So there's from one side there is the cost competitiveness of Chinese supply, and from the other side there's a massive diversity of drivers, everything from city level initiatives for electric buses or passenger EVs and major state-led solar projects in the Middle East to individual electricity users in the countries that I mentioned, Pakistan and South Africa, basically using solar panels to fend off blackouts. So yeah, when you start to drill into the importing market, it becomes a very a diverse picture. Just to say a couple of more words about the regional split. The single largest region by value still remains the EU or developed Europe, certainly for EVs, but also for the four products put together. But the Middle East and North Africa region and the South Asia region also stand out. And one more way to look at this is if we look at the exports of clean energy products in relation to the size of the energy systems, then it's in fact sub-Saharan Africa that stands out along with the Middle East, North Africa region. So you can say that Chinese exports of clean energy products are, in relative terms, having the largest impact on the energy system in those two places. In terms of the North American market, one reason why that market has, or basically the U.S. market, one reason why Chinese exporters have paid more attention to that market than the market share numbers would suggest is that the earlier tariffs on solar created a dynamic where anyone who is able to sell to the U.S. makes very nice margins because the tariffs raised the prices of solar panels in the U.S. far above the levels in the rest of the world. So then those solar firms that invested in overseas manufacturing or assembly to be able to sell to the U.S. We're deriving very nice profits out of that. So that's of course having an impact on their bottom line, and much more so than the very small percent that the U.S. uses of global solar would suggest. The earlier tariffs had already reconfigured the global solar market in a way that basically everything that could be made outside of China was going to the U.S. And so there's no non-Chinese supply really available for others. but it was just enough to supply the U.S. market. And of course, now the whole mess with tariffs imposed on everyone and so on has created further uncertainty about that.
Yeah, thanks, Lauri. Fascinating trade dynamics. So you talked mostly about the export of China's clean tech products to the rest of the world. Kate, you've also been looking at China's increasing investment in green foreign, FDI to other parts of the world. What are the important points there, and why do you think that is potentially also politically significant?
Sure. I appreciate you bringing this up, and a nice segue from exports to foreign direct investment and manufacturing capacity abroad, because there is a strong linkage in terms of how everything fits together. And, based on the data that others have, deeply researched, we see, first of all, an important trend in that China's overseas lending, sovereign loans for new energy infrastructure have dropped dramatically to less than $1 billion over several recent years, from 2022 or 2021 to 2023, and sort of less than 1% of the total amount from 2013 to 2020. And at the same time, last year in 2024, China committed over 50 billion, based on some figures, for new manufacturing capacity for clean technologies overseas. And I'd also emphasize that this investment is going most places in the world as well, except for the U.S. So that's important to take into account. So it's not just Belt and Road countries, for instance, but going to a wider scope globally. And I think this really reflects the importance of China's clean tech companies to its economy domestically. And Lauri and others have done the number crunching on this and found that last year in 2024, these sectors accounted for about a quarter of economic growth and about 10% of total GDP. So, they're really, the story is very different now from this sort of, Belt and Road overseas energy lending for infrastructure, in terms of what's important to pay attention to going forward, since these factories could have an output value of over 100 billion, once they're complete. The second piece that I'd emphasize is that these companies are commercially driven, and as there are challenges in terms of countries dealing with what they might see as a flood of imports, and trying to handle that impact on their economy, they might adopt some trade barriers. But at the same time, Chinese companies will seek out markets that are perhaps a little bit more politically agnostic in terms of welcoming FDI. So as the exports piece becomes a little bit more challenging, we actually might see an acceleration in investment in overseas manufacturing capacity. I think, initially this may have been driven more by attempts to tariff jump, but I think, the linkage there is, evolving over time. And this is something that, we'll certainly see an increasing trend in. And then I think the third piece to emphasize is that these companies, they're largely commercially driven. They're mostly, sort of private enterprises in the Chinese context. But because they're so significant now, they then are influencing how Beijing carries out its diplomacy internationally. So you'll see, on one hand, the emphasis on clean tech sectors and high-level rhetoric, such as at the World Economic Forum, remarks by Deng Xuexiang, or Xi Jinping in his remarks at the previous forum that I mentioned, hosted by the UN Secretary General and Lula. You'll see the elevation of high-level deals as part of China's bilateral diplomacy, such as we saw recently with Lula's visit to Beijing, and a slew of new deals announced for clean tech sectors. And then at the same time, we'll see Beijing potentially stepping in to delay or sort of hinder investments where they might not necessarily match its interests or be politically in line with what Beijing would like to see. So for instance, in the case of India, we've seen some interference, or, another example that's been referenced is BYD's factory in Mexico being delayed because of the tensions between the U.S. and China, and obviously the Mexico linkage to the U.S. market. So I think those are some key trends to watch in this area.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I think a fascinating bilateral relationship that has both the trade and the investment element is the one between China and the European Union. Anders, can help our audience unpack that dynamic a little bit? The European Union, of course, has imposed some trade tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. At the same time, there is also a desire from the European side to attract Chinese investment and facilitate some level of tech transfer. What's kind of the future outlook in your mind for this bilateral relationship in the clean tech sector?
Yeah, I think that you hit on a couple of the key points there. In addition, I think that one thing you didn't mention is I think that especially in the wake of what's going on with the United States in tariffs, the countries of Europe, generally speaking, would still be very strongly attached to the WTO system and would perceive themselves as beneficiaries of the global trading regime that still does allow relatively free movement of goods and would not want to overturn entirely the institutions that exist that protect their own exports and their own domestic industries. And so being competitive with China, even if there is a lot of rhetoric surrounding having a more level playing field and also some very real need to bring some technology from China, which is now very much at the technology frontier in the battery space, in the solar space, there is the need for that technology transfer, but I don't think there's going to be a wholesale rush to impose some very stringent domestic content requirements and rules or very strong mandates for licensing requirements. I think there will be some movement in that direction, and you certainly see that under the Net Zero Industries Act and the related legislation that just came out. I think that the Chinese side, however, may be overly optimistic about how much Europe will continue to be open to China. And there is, I think, the perception in China that the Trump administration and the disputes, both trade and political, between Europe and the United States and between the United States and its other allies are just an unalloyed good for China, and that this China will be the only beneficiary of those. And I think the answer is going to be much more nuanced, that Europe is very much still trying to build out its manufacturing capacity and ensure that these economies in Europe and elsewhere in the world, that they do remain advanced economies, will require some competition and some tough bargaining with China that perhaps the Chinese side does not really anticipate right now.
Great, Anders, and very much agree with you. I also certainly feel that probably not very justifiable Chinese optimism when it comes to engaging with the European side. But I hope some things will be clarified in about a month's time when the two sides meet at the highest level at the EU-China bilateral summit. Kate, I want to go back to you and spend a few minutes on COP30, the UN climate summit that will be held in Brazil in November this year. Can you just talk a little bit about China's position in the run-up to the COP? And of course, just noting all the geopolitical developments since COP29, how do you think China will, in general, approach the COP, and what kind of role do you think the very critical relationship between China and Brazil will play into the context of COP30?
All important questions, and certainly keen for your thoughts as well, Shuo. I think the first thing I'd emphasize before even focusing on China is just the question of what does Brazil want out of the COP in the first place? And I raise this in part because there's no sort of big ticket negotiating item on the table this year, as there was last year with the climate finance goal or previously. So in that regard, there are a few negotiating items, but the broader focus of Brazil so far has been on this idea of implementation. But I think there's a question about what does that actually mean or look like in practice in the context of what comes out of COP30 this fall. From China's perspective, obviously there's a deep interest in preserving the multilateral architecture. And I think in particular, as Shuo alluded, the relationship between Brazil and China is certainly something to watch in this regard. Brazil also has a strong interest similarly. And we've seen this this relationship evolve in recent years and months. So, for instance, just to highlight, Lula went to Beijing earlier this year. Brazil is also, they hosted the G20 last year. They are hosting the BRICS summit this July, and Xi Jinping is expected to attend that. Will be another sort of high-level deepening of that relationship. So how do Brazil and Beijing work together in that regard? I think that their interests are slightly different, and I think it's difficult for Brazil to get much more ambition out of China, but they have, an aligned interest in terms of ensuring that the COP is still a productive space. And I think one potential piece to watch for is, does implementation actually mean real economy progress through investment deals or other, sort of announcements on the side of the COP that might not be part of the traditional COP infrastructure. I think another piece to watch as well is what happens with trade tensions in the context of the COP. And this is sort of a little bit of a side issue, but it's becoming more of an important question overall. There's a term in multilateral negotiating lingo called, quote unquote, unilateral measures. And this basically refers to trade barriers that prevent climate progress. And, some of the major developing economy emitters have put this on the table for the agenda a number of times in the past and keep raising it. And it's never really made it into the core agenda. But I think, it's sort of gotten to the point where this is something that it's clear needs to be addressed for climate progress. So I think there's also a question around how that might be addressed as well. But Shuo, I might turn it back to you to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I think, I think as you mentioned, Kate, the Sino-Brazilian relationship has become very robust under President Lula's leadership. And the two leaders, Lula and Xi, have met multiple times over the last 12 months or so. And I do think that's a source for potential success for COP30. I do think China at a very high political level will support the Brazilian presidency's agenda. And I think the key question, of course, is how will China balance that desire to support Brazil, but also multilateralism, with some of its domestic constraints? The continued reliance on coal and other, climate headwinds. How that balance will be reflected in China's approach toward COP30, but also in its own NDC. I think those are really critical questions and difficult ones.
Yeah, and I'd also just emphasize, we've seen China take sort of, incremental steps toward shifting its role within the UNFCCC, especially last year as it announced its climate finance on terms that were more akin to developed countries and developing countries. But I think, I'd caution, against, sort of any expectation for dramatic changes in China's posture, because China will continue to sort of play the same role that it has previously, in terms of its negotiating position, but maybe there will be incremental shifts in how it, sort of navigates the broader dynamics within the multilateral regime. And in the Brazil context as well, just noting that Brazilian domestic politics are also challenging. So both countries are in, sort of a difficult spot in that regard, but, hope to see good progress.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. I want to wrap it up by posing maybe one last question to all of you. And that question is, what will be the one issue that you will be paying close attention to for the rest of 2025 to kind of, help you understand China's climate trajectory? Maybe Lauri, let's go to you first, followed by Anders and Kate.
I'm actually a bit more cautious than Anders was in saying that the wind and solar boom will continue. I think that's very much an open question. So right now, China's power market is going into a bit of a glut, a bit of an oversupply situation. And at the same time, as Anders explained, solar and wind new projects are supposed to secure contracts from the market. We won't see the full impact this year because this is the target year for the 5-year plan. So a lot of large-scale projects will still complete this year, but we will certainly see it, especially in the distributed solar segment. And I think both for the power industry and for the steel industry, how the oversupply situations get resolved, whether the hammer really comes down on the coal-fired power plants, on the coal-based steel plants, or whether it's more of a this is everyone's problem. There's too much of everything, and that leads to a slowdown in clean energy. That's the open question, and I very much, of course, recognize what Anders said, that economically it's very hard to see that this clean energy boom would go away or would get slowed down significantly. But I know also that for China's policymakers, the idea of continuing to integrate this amount of solar and wind every year and pushing through with the reforms, pushing through with in the grid, pushing through with the eventual downsizing of the coal power fleet that entails is also going to be challenging. So really, all the signals that point to how this conflict gets resolved will be the key focus.
Anders?
Yeah, just to clarify one point, if we define boom as continued rapid growth, I would not expect a boom. I would expect more a continuation at the present rate of installations.
Yeah, no, that's what I mean as well. So yeah, just be good. Yeah, good to clarify. So
and the same
currently,
the
government is saying that they want more than 200 gigawatts and per year of new solar and wind, and the market has been delivering well over 300. So that's the gap, and staying at those current levels is what I meant by boom as well.
Yeah. And the same thing I think would be true for EVs. So for the one thing that I'm putting forward as what I will follow in the next year, I think that the competitors with China in the EVs and battery spaces have been very surprised, amazed, maybe dismayed at the progress China has made. But each time there's a new milestone, there seems to be a little bit of an expectation that, well, now this is it. Now this is what we have to deal with. And then another announcement comes out. So I think that even under hyper competition and slowing growth in the space of batteries and EVs, we should anticipate that this extreme domestic competition for the domestic market is going to continue to lead to more well-performing, low-cost vehicles in all niches. And as well, the overcapacity in the battery manufacturing space means more grid batteries as well. And that improved price performance and overall performance will track into the battery space for grid as well. And that is going to make the transition to electric vehicles globally and in China smoother, easier, even as some companies undoubtedly will be going bankrupt and there will be headlines about a bloodbath in this sector. It's going to be very contradictory, but you should expect more gee whiz announcements like what we had earlier this year with the 1 megawatt charging. I don't know how important that is, but it definitely made headlines worldwide. And then, new products like the Xiaomi new vehicle, which is, selling like hotcakes, even though it's had some problems as well. I anticipate more new developments like that. And those new developments are going to be coming to the rest of the world as well. Even if they're blocked in North America or in Europe, they're going to be coming to the rest of the world. And that will help the energy transition.
Kate, you have the final word.
Great. I might cheat and raise two pieces that I'm watching. The first is how third countries navigate their relationships with China and the U.S. vis-a-vis the global energy transition. And will they essentially sort of succumb to these overtures from the U.S. to push fossil fuels in long-term contracts? Or, how will they navigate China's clean tech dominance and this glut of cheap clean tech exports? Both are challenging in different ways, but obviously for the global energy transition, one is better than the other. And as Anders alluded, the EV penetration will have a significant impact on global oil consumption as well. So that's certainly another piece to watch. And then second piece that I'd mention is just when and how, and this is a little bit more near term, China will announce its NDC. because that's something that's expected to happen in the next few months. And there are different ways that China could do that: unilaterally, bilaterally, multilaterally. With Xi going to Brazil for BRICS, there's an EU-China summit, and then there's the big UN General Assembly in September. So there's a couple different moments, but certainly something that will indicate how China sees the importance of its NDC in the context of global climate diplomacy. But yeah, Li Shuo, what are you watching?
Well, I guess one thing that I've been paying attention is just how China's official rhetoric on climate action has evolved actually just over the last couple of months, with this increasing and stronger realization that advancing the climate agenda, both at home but increasingly globally, serves the country's economic interest, right? Because at the end of the day, China is really the superpower when it comes to to the clean tech sector. So this stronger realization of the alignment between economic interests and what China should do globally on the climate agenda, I think that's just a fascinating topic. It also tells us how kind of China sees itself, on an evolving basis, and also sees its evolving international responsibilities. I also think, most importantly, this is probably an area that will give us hope for climate action in an otherwise very difficult political and economic circumstance. So I think that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank all our panelists, Lauri, Anders, and Kate. And I also want to thank our audience for tuning in. We certainly look forward to reconvening this group later this year to further unpack China's climate agenda and its energy transition. Thanks, everybody.